Welcome in, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're traveling back to Roman Britain. But, and this is the really interesting part, we're going to be focusing on just one skeleton. One seemingly ordinary skeleton with an extraordinary story.
It's fascinating. What really drew me to this case is how easily it could have been overlooked.
Oh, okay, now you've got to tell me more. What are we talking about here?
Picture this. 2016, archaeologists are digging at a site in Fenstanton, England. It's near an old Roman road, so of course they're expecting to find, the usual stuff.
Right, like broken pottery, maybe an old coin if they're lucky.
Exactly. And they weren't disappointed. They uncovered a burial ground, which again, not unusual for a Roman site, and found 48 skeletons.
Okay, 48 skeletons. That's a lot of skeletons.
No.
But we're here for one in particular, right? What's so special about, what is it, skeleton 4926?
Right, 49 and 26. Here's the thing. Nothing really stood out about the skeleton, at least at first. Not during the dig, anyway. It was only later, back in the lab, as they were carefully cleaning the bones, that they noticed something rather shocking.
A shocking detail on a skeleton. All right, you've got my attention. What was it? Some rare bone disease. Evidence of an ancient battle wound.
It was a nail.
A nail, like a rusty old nail.
Well, yes, but it was driven straight through the heel bone.
Okay, now that is unusual, but people use nails for all sorts of things back then, right? How could they be sure it wasn't, I don't know, part of a coffin or something?
That's the thing about archaeology. You have to consider every possibility. Could it have been accidental? Did it get there during burial? Was it part of some ritual we don't understand?
So they had to rule all of that out. And
The position of the nail, the way it pierced the bone, the fact that there were no other similar finds at the site, it all pointed to one conclusion.
let me guess, this wasn't just some random nail.
This man, skeleton 4926, he was crucified. And that's where this deep dive gets really interesting, because now we're not just talking about a skeleton, right? We're talking about a real person, someone who lived and breathed, someone who died a very gruesome death. And the question becomes, who was he?
Okay, yeah, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. But how do you even begin to answer that question? I mean, we've got this skeleton, we've got this nail, but what else do we have to go on?
Well, thankfully, archaeology has a few more tools in its arsenal than it used to. We're not just digging with trowels and brushes anymore.
All right, so what did they do? What kind of high-tech analysis did they throw at this skeleton?
Well, first of all, they did CT scans.
Okay, now those are cool. I've seen those on those like medical dramas. What can you see with a CT scan of a skeleton?
We're talking about being able to examine a skeleton in 3D, inside and out, without even having to touch it, which is important because, these bones are incredibly fragile.
Yeah, that makes sense. But, I mean, what kind of details can you actually see?
Well, in this case, through the CT scans and with the help of good old-fashioned osteoarchaeology.
Now, there's a word I haven't heard in a while, osteoarchaeology. I think we might need a quick refresher for our listener.
Right, of course. Osteoarchaeology is basically the study of human skeletal remains from archaeological sites.
So, like, what can you learn from a pile of old bones? Can you tell if someone was right-handed? What they ate for breakfast?
Well, maybe not breakfast, but you'd be surprised. By examining things like bone density, muscle attachments, any signs of disease or injury, we can piece together a remarkably detailed picture of an individual's life.
So it's like reading their biography, but instead of words, it's written in bone.
Precisely. And in 4926's case, his bones tell us that he was male, somewhere between 35 and 40 years old when he died.
So right in the prime of life, or at least what we consider the prime of life today, did they learn anything else from his bones?
Well, they also tell a story of a difficult life. You see, the muscle attachments on his bones, they suggest that he was no stranger to hard labor. We're talking heavy lifting, repetitive strain. This was a man who used his body.
Which isn't all that surprising, right? I mean, if you think about life in Roman Britain, for most people, it was probably pretty tough going.
Absolutely. And on top of that, radiocarbon dating allowed us to pinpoint his death to around 250 AD. So we know for sure he lived and died during the Roman period, which of course lines up with what we know about crucifixion.
Right, because the Romans, they weren't shy about using crucifixion as a form of punishment. So, okay, we've got this rough sketch of who this guy might have been. A working-class man living in Roman Britain who met a very, let's say, untimely end. But to really understand his story, we need some context, don't we? What was life actually like back then?
Well, you have to imagine Britain in the 3rd century as this kind of a land of contrasts. You've got these bustling Roman towns with their baths and their forums and their temples, but then you've also got vast stretches of countryside where life probably hadn't changed all that much in centuries.
So where does someone like 4926 fit into all of this? Was he living the good life in the Roman town or eking out a living in a rural village somewhere?
It's impossible to say for sure, but his skeleton tells us he probably wasn't one of those wealthy Romans, lounging around the baths. Remember those signs of hard labor we talked about? He was more likely part of that backbone of the Roman economy, the farmers, the laborers, the craftsmen who kept everything running.
So not exactly a glamorous life.
Not quite. But here's the thing about 4926. He wasn't just a collection of bones, he was a person. And as we dig deeper, we uncover these incredible details about his life, like what he ate, and even where he came from.
Okay, now you're just teasing me. From bones to isotopes, it sounds like we're about to get into some really fascinating stuff. Don't go anywhere, listeners. We'll be right back with more on the extraordinary story of Skeleton 4926. All right, listeners, we're back, and I'm dying to hear more about this Skeleton 4926. Last we left off, you were about to tell us about his diet and where he's from, all from analyzing isotopes.
It really is remarkable what we can learn from these chemical signatures locked inside us. So in 4926's case, the analysis of his bones, it revealed high levels of nitrogen isotopes.
High levels of nitrogen, and that tells you.
It tells us that he had a protein-rich diet, lots of meat, which actually it started to change our understanding of what everyday Romans ate.
Really? I always thought they were all about, grains and olives and that sort of thing.
There's definitely some truth to that, but it seems like meat was a more common part of their diet than we previously thought. And that's just from his diet. Isotopes can also tell us about where someone lived, or at least where they traveled during their lifetime.
Right, because the food you eat, the water you drink, it all leaves a trace, doesn't it? Like a chemical fingerprint.
Exactly. And when we looked at the isotopes in 49926's bones, well, they painted a pretty clear picture. He probably never traveled far from where he was born.
Wow. That's kind of sad in a way, to think he never got to experience anything outside of, his little corner of Roman Britain. It really makes you appreciate how much the world has changed, doesn't it? But we were talking about the clues 4926 left behind. What else did you find?
Well, remember those CT scans I mentioned?
Of course! That's how you found the nail in the first place.
Right, but they revealed other interesting things about him, too. For example, we noticed this difference in bone density between his right and left arms. One arm in particular showed signs of, repetitive stress, which could indicate a specialized craft or trade.
So he wasn't just a laborer, he was a craftsman too. What kind of things could he have made?
It's hard to say for sure, but based on the bone density patterns, it's possible he was, maybe a weaver or a potter, something that involved a lot of repetitive twisting or turning motions with his arm.
It's incredible to think about, him making things with his hands all those centuries ago. But we still haven't talked about the elephant in the room. Or maybe I should say the nail in the heel. Why crucifixion? What could he have possibly done to deserve such a brutal fate?
Yes. The shadow of the cross. It's a question that has haunted historians for centuries.
So are there any theories? What do we know about crucifixion in Roman Britain?
Well, it's important to understand that while it seems like an incredibly cruel punishment to us, in Roman times, crucifixion was actually pretty common.
Really? I mean, I know they weren't exactly known for their leniency, but that's still pretty intense.
It was a way of making a statement, a way to deter crime and instill fear, especially in those who might challenge Roman authority.
Makes sense. So who got crucified?
Well, Roman society was very hierarchical. At the top, you had the honestiores. These are the elites, the privileged few. And then you had the humiliores, the common folk, like our craftsmen, who had far fewer rights and protections under the law.
So someone like 4926, he was basically at the mercy of the Roman legal system.
Exactly. And we also know that in the 3rd century A.D., around the time 4926 was alive, the legal system was undergoing some changes. The punishments for the lower classes, they actually became more severe.
Oh, wow. So we may never know what he actually did.
We can speculate, of course. Was he a thief? Did he disrespect a Roman official? Was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time? We simply don't know.
It's tragic, really. His story, his whole life erased.
It is. But even in death, there's a glimmer of humanity in 4926's story.
What do you mean?
Crucified victims were often left to rot, you see, as a warning to others. But that's not what happened to 4926. He was buried in the cemetery alongside the others. Someone, maybe even his family, risked a lot to claim his body and give him a proper burial.
That's really touching. It really speaks to, the enduring power of human connection. And that's not all, right? You mentioned something about DNA analysis.
Ah, yes. The DNA analysis done on the other skeletons of Fensington, it revealed that many of them were related, distant cousins, maybe even siblings.
Wow, so he wasn't just some lone individual. He was part of a community, a family.
And they cared enough to give him a dignified burial. He wasn't forgotten.
Which brings us, I think, to the most incredible part of this story. The part where science allows us to, in a way, bring 4926 back to life.
You're talking about the facial reconstruction.
I am. What did he look like?
Using his skull as a base, forensic artists were able to model the layers of muscle, tissue, and skin, rebuilding his face. He looks like someone you might pass on the street today. Someone with a story to tell.
It's amazing, isn't it? The things we can learn from a single skeleton.
It really makes you realize that history is about more than just dates and battles. It's about real people. People like 4926s.
Well said. And on that note, dear listeners, we've come to the end of our deep dive. But the story doesn't end here. What will you take away from 4926's story? What will you remember? Till next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop being curious about the world around you.